Hey everybody, I'm JD. I'm back with another game from the ChessGoals repertoire, and this one coming from the Caro-Kann Exchange. And I'm going to skip past the opening, and if you guys are interested in learning more about the opening, you can head over to ChessGoals and get the full course there. Anyhow, this is a position from the Caro-Kann Exchange where Black has opted to take, and we have captured our pawn back. And here, White played bishop to e2, which is the first move that's not covered in the ChessGoals repertoire. And here the best reply is queen b6, which is what we would have went ahead and played against queen d4 itself. And we're touching this pawn onto b2. We're also defending this guy. And this is generally a nice square for the queen anyway. It attacks a lot of diagonals and frees up the square d8 eventually for the rook perhaps. As we'll see, will come important into this game because White is almost certainly going to play c5 at some point to strike against our center, and the d file is going to open up. So here White played queen to c4. Queen d4 also possible, and so is b3. But I think b3 is probably a bit odd because it weakens this diagonal, or excuse me, well, yes, it does weaken this diagonal because there's no c3 anymore. And it weakens the c3 square especially, so if the knight comes to land there, it might feel a bit vulnerable after the rook comes. So after queen to c1, White went ahead and played bishop to d7, with the idea of maybe bringing the bishop out and trading it off, or when this c5 happens, or c4 in exchange happens, maybe it's going to come to c6 and actually be a pretty active bishop instead of trapped behind the pawn chain. White castle, Black made a natural developing move. Perhaps we're going to come out to g6, or maybe just come out to f5 and be an active piece. White did go ahead and strike with c4, and Black followed up with a natural rook move, just developing and lining up with the queen, and perhaps making it a bit uncomfortable for White to capture on d5. We don't necessarily want to take on d5 immediately because it does help develop the bishop. We're not going to do that until we have to. Knight to c3, which does sort of encourage us to take, and so White did go ahead and take. If we'd made if we'd allowed White to capture us, we'd end up with a knight takes. We'd have an isolated pawn, and maybe we're not so happy with the isolated pawn. So bishop takes, and now castles. So rook to d1, and the fight for the d file begins, which is going to be a prominent theme in this game. You're going to see lots of action on the d file and trying to take control of that. Black strikes back, and we get rook to d6. Preparing to double on the file and touching this queen, creating a bit of awkward situation here. Bishop to c6 makes sense, and now knight to d4. Again, putting pressure against this bishop, but we head out to g6, making Black remember that they did just lose, or not lose, but they did just remove a defender from the e5 square. They don't necessarily want to play f4 because this knight is potentially hanging. So after f4, I wouldn't be, yeah, this is probably going to turn out quite poorly. We just capture, and then knight to d3, knight to b3. We can just move this knight. And we hit the queen, we attack the knight, he can capture, but we can take back, and we're going to get the bishop right back. So f4 is not really an option. So White chose instead to play knight takes c3, and we take with the pawn. At first sight, you might think maybe I want to take with the rook here, but that's actually quite bad because they're going to take. We take back, and we're not going to have anywhere near the same sorts of things we get with the rook staying on the d file. White can play queen to e3, touching this guy, defending the pawn. They're going to bring the rook over next, and it's not so great. However, going back, if we capture with the pawn instead, we get a couple good things. One, we leave this rook on the d file, and we're ready to replace it with another rook, but also we stop the white pieces from using either one of these squares, which is quite nice that we get to keep him out. White played queen to e3 anyway. Again, they couldn't play f4 for similar problems as last time. So knight to d7, again, just adding extra pressure to this pawn. We're happy to trade queens because this pawn is quite weak, and we're a bit better developed. So queen takes. Instead, if they tried like rook a to d1, really trying to clamp down on the d file, they do get the d file. We capture here though, they capture here, we grab this guy. These knights are making the d file pretty ineffective, and we'll swing our rooks out of the way, and then we can move the knight, make luft for our king, and we're going to be quite happy here. We are up a pawn. We have additional targets. This guy's going to be weak. We can maybe attack this guy. We are hitting the bishop right now. This would be quite happy to see this go. So instead, white chose to play queen takes. And again, the natural thing that you might think to do is to take with the pawn. We're supposed to take towards the center. We're supposed to correct our pawn structures. But the same problem. If we capture with the pawn, fixing our pawns, we have, again, this really annoying pin. And we've given up total control of the d-file. And yes, maybe we're going to... Well, we can't actually even take the pawn right now. It's... well, I suppose we can because we're hitting this guy. But this is not the same situation. It's not nearly as comfortable. F4 is potentially coming. In the last line, remember the pawn was on E3, so this knight was stable on E5. But with the pawn able to go to F4, that's going to create some potential problems for us. So instead we choose to take with the knight. That comes with tempo, making it more difficult for this rook to swing across. And here we chose bishop to a6, and here's the beginning of a nice tactical sequence. We capture the pawn, and the point is, if you capture our rook, we'll just take your rook. And it's just a trade of rooks. We have firm control of the d-file with access probably coming all the way to d2 with pressure along the second rank. So that's not going to happen. So white chose rook to d1. And again, we probably could get away with trading and maybe just moving the rook, but another nice move, just knight to d5. Cutting off the connection between these rooks and threatening now to take. So white played f4, kicking our knight out of the way, and we just dropped back to g6. We're now threatening to win another pawn. White did choose to capture, so we capture back. And here they chose d3, defending this pawn. But we're already up a clean pawn. We have a nice active knight in the center. We're going to entangle our rook and have access to this. To the d-file, maybe come across to the b-file, all kinds of good things happening. First, chose to bring the knight back, kick that bishop out so that we can move our rook, which is going to allow us to move this knight. White chose to go out to a6, and now rook to d7. The point being that we want to drop back to a defended square so that we can exchange these rooks, or at least fight for the control of the d-file. Knight to e4. We do drop back, and white chose to exchange, and we exchange, and we have an endgame now with very few minor pieces and no major pieces at all, and we're a clean pawn up. And so the game plan is going to be to activate the knights and then bring the king up to this side of the board and start trying to create problems. This guy does look weak, but it's not terribly easy to attack. I mean, worst case, we can put it on a dark square, defend it by a knight, and black really can't ever touch it. White chose to come into d6, which looks like a nice active square. We bring the king across, just coming closer. a3. And now the knight comes out to c5, kicking that bishop away. Goes bishop to c4. Now we bring the knight up again. Again, we're totally happy if he wants to trade off his bishop for our knight. And then leave us with a single knight and a pawn up. That's almost certainly an easily winning endgame. Knight endgames are often said to be similar to pawn endgames, and a pawn endgame with a clear pawn up is a pretty easy one to win. White chose b4. They're trying to avoid trading pieces, but it's actually not that easy to do because we have this threat of the king coming out to e7, and it wasn't clear where the knight was going to go and not get traded. So b4 aims to kick this knight away to free up some squares for the knight to come out. Knight to c8 instead. Coming down to try to harass this pawn is not going to get us anywhere. We can go knight to b6, and again, we immediately have trades. You're forced to capture our knight, and we have now clean pawns, and we're still a clean pawn up, and we still have this plan of bringing our king up and advancing our majority. We're going to play e5 at some point to bring our king to e5, and once our king gets really active, it's going to be very difficult for white to hold anything here. So going back, I chose b4. But one of the drawbacks of b4 is that the closer these pawns come down the file, the weaker they're going to be. They're essentially walking into our king. And the closer they are to our king, the bigger problem they are. They're getting further away from the white king and closer to the black king, which can't be good. Knight d7, just skipping out of the way. We'll probably come back out to b6. King to f2, immediately jumping out to b6. Bishop to b3. And now king to e7, kicking the knight out. The knight went back to b7, Going to head to c5. It looks like a nice outpost, but it's not going to be a sturdy place for the knight to stay. We went knight to c7. The idea being that we want to come perhaps out to b5, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn has moved up the board and is not too safe anymore. And the closer these pawns come, again, the worse it's going to be. So knight to c5. Now, if a4 immediately, that doesn't really help things. We can just go right back to d5. We're hitting this pawn. Got to move it. There's no other way to defend it. And we've just won a clean pawn again. And this outside posture is ready to roll. So knight c5. And we bring the knight up. Again, coaxing that pawn to move forward. a4. And now knight to d4. Hitting the bishop. Again, we don't want trades. If the bishop comes, this guy falls. So the bishop drops back, and now we bring the other knight in. And these knights are awesome. Look at all the squares that they control. They are shielding this king completely out. This king is not going to come in. It would have to make this crazy maneuver if it wants to come and try to help defend the pawns. And in the meantime, it's going to go bad. We're touching this pawn already, and it's going to be quite difficult. Knight to a6 is what white chose, just trying to desperately hang on to the pawn. But now this knight is fixed. It's never going to move again because this pawn is simply going to fall. Bishop to f3 was another idea maybe, but this, again, we're totally happy to just capture. And then something like knight to c3, again, coaxing this pawn a bit further forward. And then this king is just going to come in and calmly collect the pawn. So knight c5 maybe, no problem. We'll come up here, attack, you drop back. And now your knight's kicked out, and we're going to win the pawn no matter what. So instead, a5 was chose, because they're really running out of moves. They can't bring the king any closer. This bishop can't really move. This knight can't really move. You don't really want to move any of your pawns. I suppose you're free to move this a-pawn a couple times, but you're going to have to deal with the fact that you've got to make a move at some point. So here, black chose f6. And the point is, I want to play e5, and I want to capture and move this pawn out of the way so that my king can come forward. So h4, and then e5. Black chose to take, or sorry, white chose to take, and the king came up, and bishop to g4. At a loss for a better idea. So knight to c2, just pointing out that since this bishop is now gone, we can double up on this guy. And there's not really any good way to defend it at all. White made one last move with knight to c5. We captured the pawn, and then here he resigned. He's down 2 pawns now. This pawn is almost certainly going to fall. Our king is really active. Both of our knights are super active. And just a really nice game. Some really cool ideas and a few key moments in here that I think that we want to share and take away. The one being that it is important, or not, it is important and helpful and a good square for our queen to come to, coming out to b3 and putting that pressure, b6 coming out and putting this pressure here. And then this idea of the bishop coming out to d7 to c6. But also when the knight took here on c6, maintaining control of this d file by capturing with the b pawn is something that we definitely want to try to keep in mind. I think a lot of us would be tempted to take with the rook, especially with the queen sitting there on c1. It makes a lot of sense why you would want to do that, but ultimately it just doesn't help here. And having this pawn here is actually quite strong. Despite being isolated and on that half-open file, it does help control some key squares and is quite a nice stronghold for us. Anyhow, I hope this helps, and I wish you guys the best of luck. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and head over to ChessGoals for the full course and more videos. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.